Hello everyone and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for the next webinar in our DiMe series here. I'm delighted to welcome you all today to listen in as Ben Birnbaum, Irene Chen and Luca Foschini to machine learning for healthcare professionals. Andy Coravos, my co-founder here at DiMe, is going to be moderating the session today. And before I hand over to her to dive in, just some quick housekeeping. We have a lot of information to cover with you guys today, but we have made sure to leave time for questions at the end. The best time to handle this and the best way for us to tackle all of your questions. For folks on the webinar, down at the bottom of your screen, there should be a ribbon. There's a Q&A section and there's a chat section. I recommend using the Q&A section, and Andy Coravos will handle those questions and pose them to our experts at the end of the session. So welcome everyone. I'm thrilled you're here, and Andy, let me hand over to you.
Hey all, I'm very excited that you're here. Also, if you are watching this later as a recording, you're welcome to reach out to any of us via Twitter. The link will be on the DiMe website, and then all of our Twitter handles are there as well. And so feel free to ask those questions too. I'm very excited about this, this webinar in particular. And Jen, if you can hop to the next slide, because I'm not sure how many of you end up going to all of these conferences these days that say like, what is AI going to do for healthcare? And it is this like big nebulous term. And I was at one of those conferences a couple months ago, and we were, they had 4 panelists all together, and we were supposed to talk about AI/machine learning. And one of the things that was really important for me was for us to define what that actually meant and what our bounds were. And pretty quickly in the prep calls, I realized that all 4 of us had a very different sense of what that meant. And there's a Twitter joke that I really love, which is that if it's written on a PowerPoint slide, it's AI. And if it's written in Python, then it's machine learning. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time today thinking about like, what is machine learning, and how can we prep people who are working in today's healthcare system to think about what it means and what it is. And a pet peeve of mine is I think a lot of times people try to articulate whether or not somebody is technical. And I very strongly think that if you are operating on the internet or working with any of these tools, you have some level of technical capability. It's not that you're technical or you're not. Some people it's much more of a spectrum, a lot of time in a very technical part of the field, but all of us have to interact there. And so my goal for today's session is that you get to go higher on the technical ladder and you're able to work within this field. And the second thing that I think is really important is not only to define what something is, but what it isn't. And so today we have 3 of, in my opinion, the best machine learning experts who come from different backgrounds. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves a bit and what they're hoping to get out of this session too. And we'll start with Irene. Irene, can you a little bit of your background and why you decided to do this session?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Andy. Hi, everyone. My name is Irene. I am a PhD student at MIT studying machine learning in healthcare. And I think it's a really exciting field. I'm super excited that so many other people are as enthusiastic about the field as well. This past spring, I taught the MIT Machine Learning in Healthcare course, and it'll be linked later on the additional resources. So spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I hope this webinar goes great then.
Luca?
Hi, everyone. My name is Luca Foschini. I'm the co-founder and chief data scientist of Evidation Health, a company that is trying to develop new measures of health and disease in real-world settings where it's close to the patient. We use machine learning in a variety of ways. Some of those are more research-oriented, and I'll be touching upon those a little bit on the presentation. And my background is in computer science, but I've been doing Evidation for 7 years now, so I'm much more applied than Irene here.
Ben?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Birnbaum. I'm the technical lead for machine learning at Flatiron Health. Flatiron Health is an oncology technology company that's focused on improving outcomes and accelerating research in oncology. Have been doing machine learning here at Flatiron for about 3 years. My background is in computer science. And I'm really excited to be here to kind of share some of our thoughts on what machine learning is and what its promise is and kind of maybe what some of its limitations are. because it's a topic that comes up a lot when we talk to some of our customers, where we have to kind of speak within a lot of hype around machine learning and talk about what we're actually doing and what machine learning can actually solve. So very excited to be here.
All right, thank you. Jen, can you hop to the next one? So I think we all know that the FDA can approve drugs, but the question is, does the FDA also look at software? And the answer is yes. Earlier this year and over the last year or so, the FDA had started to hire software engineers and security researchers to look at how they were going to regulate software as a medical device and a lot of these algorithms. And I had the opportunity to serve at the FDA in the digital health unit. All these slides are going to be posted on the DiMe website. There's a couple really good pieces. And in the last year or two, the FDA has been clearing just pieces of software. Many of those instances are cases of machine learning algorithms and systems. And so this is not like something that's happening on the fringe. This is very much forefront of our agency and is going to be more and more a part of our everyday lives. And I think, as we all know, any sort of algorithm learns on the data that it sits on. And so in many ways, by definition, algorithms pick up different types of biases, whether we want those or not, is what we're looking for. And so now that we have more data than ever, this really provides a pretty amazing opportunity for us to have much more precise medicine. And so what we're going to go through today is effectively like a 101 of where these can be used, where these can't be used, and hand it off across from thinking about it from an academic perspective, an industry perspective. And our goal here is to give you tips and a set of language so that when you go into a meeting where someone's talking about AI or machine learning, that you are well equipped to make that as substantive of a conversation as possible. All right, let's go to the next one.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, for the couple of next slides, I really wanted to point out to you some good resources to talk about AI and machine learning from a very practical perspective. This one is an infographic representing all the FDA clearances. Actually, they're not approvals in this specific case, that have been going on in the AI ML software world in the last few years. And as you can see from the side, where years are called out in the timeline, there has been an acceleration, significant acceleration of the number of clearances granted every year. The blog post linked at the bottom of the slides, we link resources to every slides for you to be able to go back later on and do more research, but it really goes in details about talking a little bit about each one of these applications, and they really span the gamut between diagnosis and treatment of ADHD, tracking insulin dosage, quantify blood glucose level, of course, detecting arrhythmia, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. This is a good visual summary, in my opinion, of, if you will, the other side of the spectrum of ML algorithm applied in medicine. This really comes from the research world, and it's part of a paper that I highly recommend by Eric Topol on high performance medicine, the convergence of humans and artificial intelligence. Again, the link is in the slides, it really talks about, it really lists applications of machine learning across many domains. As you can see, there is cardiology, there is prediction of mortality outcomes, and the top side of the slide, I think, is a nice infographic to understand how machine learning really spans the human life, from embryo to to later in life. This tables report performances of this machine learning algorithm. We will see in a bit that it's really important to define how we measure how good these algorithms are through a performance metric. Next slides. And this last one is a table that comes from a paper very recent, a couple of weeks ago, actually, organizes a subset of the algorithms presented in the previous slides, but by therapeutic areas, and really makes the case around the importance of the data these algorithms are trained on. In fact, the paper is called "Put the Data Before the Algorithms," and makes the case that is somehow novel in this community, that there's really two fundamental applications we can think of machine learning in medicine. One is more the one that we read on the news of deep learning does X better than physician. So predictive in nature, you train a model on a large amount of data, and then you use that to understand if a patient is going to develop specific outcomes or not. But the paper really makes here a really good case around having machine learning help inductive reasoning. So having machine learning help researchers find new hypotheses, generate new hypotheses to test later on. Next.
I think this is you, Ben.
Oh, sorry about that. For some reason, I can't see it. Anyway, so thanks. So we thought it would be helpful to, as Andy mentioned, start in terms of defining machine learning by saying what it's not. And so the first thing we want to say is that it's not magic. I'd say this is obvious, but I think it's important to repeat and remember, because at least speaking personally, sometimes it can actually feel a little bit magical. And I think that's what draws a lot of, at least technologists to it. But ultimately, machine learning is just a bunch of math and algorithms that can be certainly very useful, but will also have idiosyncrasies and importantly won't work perfectly. So we actually, I think, see these errors all the time in consumer products that use machine learning. Think about, for example, like when Siri doesn't work or when autocorrect doesn't work. And especially in a domain like healthcare, it's important to understand the consequences of these errors so that machine learning can be used responsibly. The second, machine learning is not a product in and of itself. You wouldn't buy machine learning, you'd buy a product that uses machine learning. And you wouldn't do machine learning for its own sake, you'd use it as a tool to accomplish some existing goal in clinical care or research. So taking an example that we'll come back to later, consider a system that uses machine learning to identify like precancerous polyps during a colonoscopy. So in this system, machine learning is really just one component that will make or break its success. So for example, there are aspects of the user interface of the system, such as how it would alert a physician to a polyp, that I would say are at least as important as the machine learning. And of course, polyp detection is just one component of the overall success in reducing mortality from things like colon cancer. So machine learning is an important piece of the system, it's an important tool, but it's really just one among many. Third, machine learning is not something that's going to replace humans anytime soon. So machine learning is great for well-defined tasks in which there's a lot of examples to learn from. And in these situations, it can be used to make humans more efficient or more perceptive, but it doesn't do a great job at generalizing from small numbers of examples or incorporating many disparate types of knowledge or say like common sense. So for this reason, I'd say we're nowhere close to having machine learning replace doctors, even when doctors are viewed narrowly as, say, diagnosticians. When you take into account the full role that a doctor plays in patient care, including sort of emotional and decision-making support, I'd say it's even more clear that real-life doctors are not going away. So finally, Andy mentioned the term AI a couple of times. I think it's important to address it when talking about machine learning because it does come up a lot. So traditionally, AI or artificial intelligence has been sort of the science of developing computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. And already that's, I'd say, a fairly nebulous or vague definition, but these days, I think it's much more vague. As far as I can tell, what AI really means right now is kind of anything you want it to be that involves automation and data. So if I hear somebody's doing AI, that's basically all that I'll assume. Typically, machine learning is thought of as a subfield of AI, along with things like natural language processing. But to define it more precisely, I'll hand it over to Luca.
Thank you, Ben. So let's look at what machine learning is. This is a definition that might sound a little bit academic. It's widely known and used by Mitchell in '97, and doesn't have to surprise that it's so not recent, right? Like we think of machine learning as a field that's really blossomed in the last few years, but in reality, the roots go way back in history, up to 60 years ago. And the definition that I find really helpful here, not to sound academic, but really because it tells you what are the fundamental ingredients to call something machine learning is the following. It's a computer program that learns from experience, E, with respect to some class of tasks, T, and a performance measure, P. These are all very important. The experience E is the data, right? That's the part that pretty much everyone gets when they listen to machine learning. The more data, the better. But in reality, it's not only data. It's really any interaction with nature that can give out more information, that can give the computer more information, the machine more information. And then there's the two fundamental ones, in my opinion, that are often overlooked. A specific class of tasks, like Ben was saying, this is not a magic bullet. It works on a very narrowly specified task, and this task could be a classification between two classes, which is different than a classification between three classes, which is different than anomaly detection, which means understanding whether something belongs to a class or to anything else. And finally, a performance measure is also a key ingredient of a machine learning algorithm. How well does the algorithm do in performing the task? And that can be insightful, returning insightful results. It must be very well defined. Usually you hear a lot about area under the curve, AUC, but that's different from accuracy, it's different from sensitivity and specificity, it's different from root mean square error. It's really important to understand what is the algorithm evaluated on, and as we will see later in the slides, different performance metrics really yield to different use cases. So next slide. So fundamentally what machine learning does, and this is a question, this is a quote from a book that I recommend, and it's also provided as part of the references. Machine learning helps tackle tasks that are too difficult or too tedious to solve with fixed programs. So if you think about, if you ever try to write your own quote unquote AI to play chess or play Connect 4, and that usually goes as in the first iteration as a lot of if statement. If there are three opponents stones in a row, then try to block it with a fourth one, and vice versa. If you have three of yours and it's your turn, place the fourth and connect. This means directly programming the computer to do actions. Machine learning doesn't do that. Machine learning is shows an algorithm, a lot of examples, shows an algorithm, a lot of Connect 4 games with the understanding, with a label attached to it that this was the game won or lost, and the algorithm will figure out what is a good move based on the game. And that's actually how we have developed Go programs that beat humans at the computer Go program. Next slide. So really, machine learning is a tool, again, we've established, that helps humans getting away with tedious tasks and other tasks that are just so difficult to do. And so what does it ultimately do? And I think it's helpful to look at the perspective of who it can help in medicine and health. And I called out three categories here: researchers, clinicians, and participants, patients, users, individuals. I'll touch upon a little bit around the researchers. For the clinician use case and participant use case, we will have other examples from Ben and Irene later on. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a paper recently published at KDD, a conference in computer science, that does the following: looks at PPG Records. PPG is photo plethysmograph. It's that little light that you have in your Apple Watch or Fitbit that measures heart rate and tries to detect atrial fibrillation versus not. You've probably seen a lot of applications that use ECG, electrocardiogram, either single lead or multi-lead for this, single lead or multi-lead for this problem. This is an innovative application that uses that different kind of signal, which is supposed to be more noisy and more consumer grade, so to speak. So the way they do this on the left-hand side, they collect PPG records together with ECG. They have a clinician looking at the ECG and annotating whether someone is atrial fibrillation or not. They feed this into a 50-layer convolutional neural network, and then this learns whether the PPG snippets is one representing atrial fibrillations versus not. The accuracy at which this learning is done is one of the main points of the paper, but it's not really the main point that I want to make here. I find it much more interesting to look at what the authors take out as what the algorithms has learned. And this is the right-hand side of the pictures. You see that the PPG signal at the top is that little wiggly curve in blue is the input to the algorithm. And the algorithm has somehow understood that in order to discriminate between atrial fibrillation and not, it needs to look at the features that you see at the bottom of it, the 3 rows of wiggled, but a little bit more Sutov-like curves. So it turns out that the algorithms learn somewhat automatically that the first derivative, the second derivative, and systolic and diastolic peaks within the signal that are hidden to a human eye are the one that's actually relevant to make a good job of discriminating things. And so I think this is a really good example of how machine learning in this particular case can aid feature extraction in this particular case, and helps generate a hypothesis for further studies. Next. So this is another example. This is work that we did in collaboration with Apple and Eli Lilly. It was presented at the same conference actually right after the previous work that I was showing, and it looks at how you can tell mild cognitive decline, mild cognitive impairment from people with normal cognition by using a set of data collected from commercial wearable devices, Apple Watch, iPhone, sleep sensor, and iPads. I'm not going to go in details in the study design itself, but again, what I want to call out is the right-hand side of the slides. Understanding what has been used by the machine learning algorithm to discriminate between these 2 cohorts, and the fact that typing speed and changes during day circadian rhythm, together with use of Helper's app and other features of usage of the phone, it's really the key here for us of how machine learning can aid the inductive process of generating more hypotheses. Next slide. So if you think about how what I was talking about just now, how machine learning can tell you basically what are the most important features in a set of selected features, and that might sound like many other statistical methods that have been used in medicine for years and probably decades, and that's exactly the case that this infographic does. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But the point that I want to make, and that Andy Beam and Zach Cohen make here in this paper from last year, is that really we should think of machine learning algorithms used in medicine and health as part of a continuous spectrum of models that aid data analysis. So if you look at the y-axis of this plot, it plots the relative human to machine decision-making effort. So how much was the human involved in designing the model? The more you go up in the y, the more you see that these models are learning somewhat by themselves. And the more you go down to the bottom, to the x-axis, then you see things like clinical wisdom, in which there is no model at all. And you can really see that risk score calculators are at level 2, and those are the red dots, where there is somewhat of a computer use, but most of it is really put in by the modeler. And then as you move up, you see classical machine learning in yellow, and you see that cardiovascular risk prediction based on EHR are very similar in terms of algorithm to what was used to win the Netflix prize. This is number 10 and 11. And if you move up on the y-axis and you look at points 3 and 4, then you start looking at deep learning methods. And it's fun to see that next to each other, you see an algorithm to read ATM checks from the 1998, and a Google diabetic retinopathy algorithm for 2016. They're fundamentally the same in terms of input that the human needs to give to this algorithm as size of the data they are trained on. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Luca and Ben, for the great overview of what machine learning is not and then what it is. But the real question we're all here for is when it will actually work. So generally speaking, it is helpful and important to remember 3 main criteria when we think about when machine learning is likely to work or is not likely to work. The first one, sort of we're starting from the left, working towards the right. As Luca mentioned, data is the most important aspect of machine learning. If you have good data, that's sort of a great baseline to start with. Large amounts of data can help discover latent patterns in the data, and then the machine learning can use those patterns. Luckily, patients and other parts of the healthcare system are generating a large amount of health data these days, from electronic health records to hospitals to wearables like Fitbit and Apple Watch. All of this data is only helpful though, so now we're in the middle, if we have a notion of labels or reward signals for the problem that we are trying to solve. For example, when predicting from a histology slide of breast tissue whether or not that breast tissue will be benign or malignant, the machine learning algorithm needs previously labeled data from other breast tissue slides. So likely a trained pathologist will go in, look at the histology slide and say benign and malignant. The machine learning algorithm can then use those labels for other prediction tasks. Note that if we're dealing with histology slides that even a pathologist or even several pathologists disagree on, then the problem just got much, much harder. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, and this is one that gets overlooked often, I think, in the enthusiasm about machine learning, but machine learning, as Ben mentioned, is only a tool. It needs to fit into the healthcare pipeline. The most accurate and innovative algorithm will then not be helpful at all if it doesn't address problems that the doctors and other healthcare professionals are trying to answer. So what are the unmet needs in the healthcare pipeline? Where do patients, clinicians, other healthcare professionals actually need help? Those are important questions to keep in mind. Can we go to the next slide? We can think of machine learning then in 3 broad categories. So supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. First and foremost though is supervised learning. As I alluded to earlier, the example of predicting breast cancer, tumor malignancy, or if it's benign by learning from training data is a pretty classic example. So let's walk through that. We're given labeled training data, and then we feed it into a machine learning model. Here we'll use a deep learning model. Once the model is trained, we can give it new, previously unseen data. We call that test data, and the model can make a prediction from about these new slides based on the labeled training data. It's worth noting then that most deployed instances of machine learning fall into the supervised learning bucket. Most of the time when people say machine learning, they are referring to supervised learning. It's clear, it's easy to evaluate, and machines are actually quite good at supervised learning, especially now that deep learning has exploded onto the scene. Next slide. Then we have the opposite, unsupervised learning. So here we don't need label data, hence the unsupervised part of the term, and the machine learning algorithm instead tries to find any pattern it can from the data. So here as an example, we're given a bunch of asthma patients, and we want to figure out, can we group similar patients together? We don't necessarily know what a good patient is or what a bad patient is. We're just taking all the data, for example, the age of onset for the asthma patient, any symptoms they might have, and maybe any other biomarkers that we can measure. And we feed that into a machine learning algorithm to get, on the right side, these groups. Once we have these groups, a pulmonologist might go in and examine the groups and give explicit names. Here, according to this paper, which has been cited, we have late onset wheezers, we have early onset wheezers, actually kind of transient early wheezers and persistent wheezers. So we have 3 groups that the pulmonologist has now named. While we didn't need labels for the data in the first place, we do need a clinician or some sort of domain expert to actually examine the findings. People often use unsupervised learning then for hypothesis generation, so coming up with ideas that can be used later for downstream tasks. For example, which patients to target for a clinical trial or which patients to follow up on. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this is not as prime time ready in healthcare as the other 2, but it's important to bring up reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning uses a series of actions and rewards in order to figure out which action you should make at another time point. You may have seen reports in the news about machine learning algorithms, not healthcare related, but more focused on games. So playing Go, playing StarCraft, playing League of Legends. In many ways, reinforcement learning actually does mimic the clinical healthcare setting, where you sort of see how the patient is, you make a decision, you see how that turns out, make another decision. However, in games, you get to run 1,000 trials, 1,000,000 trials, and it's totally fine because it's just the game. With patients, it's a lot harder because we cannot take chances with people's lives. So here we have a diagram that shows the potential decisions for a patient in the intensive care unit with sepsis. So sepsis is a life-threatening infection. One crucial problem with reinforcement learning then is that we often look at observational data. So we only have so many patients, we can't keep running the game infinite times. As a result, we deal with smaller and smaller cohorts of the patients with each decision. So as we make each decision, then we have fewer patients. So any recommendations are prone to more error because we're making it on a smaller data set. Slide, please. All right, so we've outlined supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. So 3 big hammers to use in the healthcare setting. I have alluded to a little bit earlier, but here explicitly, what are the challenges and considerations moving forward? In other words, what could go wrong? Slide. One of the biggest challenges, and I've sort of hammered this really aggressively, one of the biggest concerns is that the data we have might be really big, but it might be pretty complicated as well. Missing data is one of the huge problems in that we often don't have all of the parts of the patient data, and we also don't have all of the patients. That can make inference or learning the machine learning algorithm much harder. So on the left-hand side, we have a very simple example where we start with 100 patients, and we want to predict how different medications affect different diseases, patients with different diseases over 2 years. Because of the data criteria we'll need, we want patients who have been in the system for over 2 years, we want all of the diagnoses noted, and we want all of the medications noted. We might only end up with 1/5 of the original data set. As another example, in the middle, as I mentioned, labels are pretty important, but even something as useful as histology slides, whether or not the tumor is malignant or benign, pathologists are pretty expensive, and getting a pathologist to go in and label slides might then be expensive, and the labels can then be scarce. And then lastly, and anyone who's worked with healthcare data can empathize here, healthcare data is notoriously noisy, super prone to errors. Here is actually an example of a healthcare reporter who was doing a story about noisy medical records, who had some medical issues, and she discovered in her own records that her own name was misspelled, the last name was misspelled, making all of the records hard to accumulate. Next slide. When the data is messy though, we might get results that don't make sense. A lot of machine learning is what's called a black box, meaning it's not immediately clear what's going on inside, whether or not it's going right or wrong. For healthcare, especially a high stakes situation, this is concerning. So interpretability is this name of methods that we give to try to shine a light on what's going on inside. Before we use a machine learning method, we could use exploratory analysis. For example, the unsupervised clustering that we went over earlier to find subgroups. Then we can incorporate interpretability methods during the machine learning model, perhaps by restricting our models to something that is very easy to understand. For example, here I've shown a very shallow decision tree, but that can be a more simplistic model than we want, and it might have lower accuracy, for example. And then lastly, there are some post hoc methods for interpretability that show where the algorithm is going to focus the most attention. We might use that as a proxy for the explanation of what the algorithm is thinking. Here, I think this is a classifier that's trying to predict if a brain has a tumor in it, and the saliency map, so the highlighted area, perfectly picks out the area that is the tumor. So a clinician might be saying, oh, that's what they're looking at. Next slide. Switching gears a little bit, we're also really concerned about these questions of bias and inequality. One goal of machine learning broadly is to assist clinicians, other healthcare professionals, and try to reduce the error and potentially the bias in the system. Unfortunately, we found that algorithms can perpetuate the bias instead. Any bias that's encoded in the data that we fed in, the algorithm will just gobble it up and start perpetuating the bias at large scale. On the left, we have results from a paper that was predicting mortality in the intensive care unit, and we've shown the error bars. When the patients self-identify as specific racial groups, we see that those patients differ dramatically by racial group. It's then important that we're very careful about the data we feed it in to make sure it is unbiased, or as unbiased as we can get it. And then we must ensure that the algorithm itself doesn't create any new bias or magnify any existing health disparities. That's really important. On the right side, we actually know that the system is already full of bias and inequality. For example, in one particularly famous analysis, ProPublica did this in 2017, we know that Black mothers in America die in childbirth at 5 times the rate as white mothers. The optimist in me actually sees this as a potential area for machine learning to improve inequality rather than contribute to it. So, and I'm happy to talk about that more to anyone who's curious. Next slide. And then one other area, so we've talked a lot about prediction. So given something we think is going to happen, we might also be interested though in causal inference. So if we did that, would that cause that? Generally speaking, causation, correlation, usually a lot of the time causation does equal correlation. So if we see a lot of tumor cells, we might say there's gonna be breast cancer, like that's how it works. In other cases, it might be a little more complicated. On the left, I've shown a very simple example where researchers noticed that people who own Fitbits had healthier hearts. Healthcare providers, this is a true story, then thought, oh, wow, we should give out Fitbits, then we get a healthier population. Unfortunately, there's an additional confounder, which is socioeconomic status. If you are richer, you are more likely to own a Fitbit, and you're also more likely to have better healthcare access, and therefore your heart might be more healthy. And in fact, we found in a randomized control trial that if you randomize whether or not someone gets a Fitbit, you do not necessarily see increases in heart health. Causal inference then from observational data, so you don't get to run the randomized control trial, is an open academic question right now. So we have to adjust for observed and unobserved confounders. The other major question in causal inference then is whether or not there's overlap between the two patient populations. If we're trying to compare 2 treatments, we want to make sure that the populations who receive each treatment have some sort of overlap. So if we have treatment A, their patients are much younger than the patients who receive treatment B, it becomes difficult and almost impossible sometimes to determine what the effect of doing treatment A on an older population or treatment B on a younger population is. So these are sort of general open questions that we're thinking about with causal inference. Next, I'll turn it over to Luca for additional thoughts on whatever. I'll let Luca go.
So, replicability is funny. It took me a long time to figure that word out. So this goes in the direction of room for improvement, and specifically in this particular case, research, machine learning for health. In this recent work, co-authors and myself took a look at 100 papers and annotated them across dimensions of how likely you are to be able to replicate the findings there. Thanks a lot, by the way, to the annotators, grad students that have worked on these tasks. This is one of these tedious tasks you might want to automate with machine learning in the future. So we found out that as compared to other disciplines where machine learning is used as a tool and they are more mature, such as natural language processing and computer vision, machine learning for health, ML4H in the plots here on the left-hand side, tends to underperform in this dimension of technical replicability, statistical replicability, and conceptual replicability. What do they mean? What do we mean by that? We mean that less likely than in other domains where machine learning is used heavily as a tool, where we're finding in the papers the code made available, public data sets used, variance of the results reported, and the results replicated in multiple data sets. We're finding that less common in machine learning for health research than other domain, which is somewhat expected because machine learning for health is more novel, is newer in terms of just like age has been around, but it's also more concerning given the risk and the things that are at stake with this kind of research. So in that paper, we also propose a solution on how things can be made better. And this goes around, this goes along the idea of keeping every stakeholder in the research in machine learning for health accountable, and this means the researchers themselves. This is on the right-hand side, the blue Venn diagram, and they should adopt more rigorous statistical methodology. And in the paper, we go more in detail what that means. We would like to see data providers be able to, if not releasing the data, because that is not always possible, at least create shared data repository or integrate multi-institute data sets of already released data sets. And then finally, journaling conferences are also in the position of improving the replicability of resulting machine learning for health by just setting a higher standards for acceptance. Next slide. And to conclude on, let's say, room for improvement for whoever has dabbled a little bit in machine learning research, even just like from the mainstream news lens, has probably heard about adversarial examples. So those are little tweaks to examples that shown to a machine learning system can fool it into believing that that thing is not the thing it was programmed to find. So for instance, there is this, one of the famous one is this classifier for detecting rifles that is being fooled by strategically 3D printing a turtle that looks to it like a rifle from every dimension, but definitely not to a human. Here we report some recent research that looks at adversarial example for health specifically. The bottom line shows that if you take one of the deep learning classifiers for AFib from single lead ECG, and then you add some strategic noise that would look invisible to a human eye, you can actually fool the classifier into thinking that AFib is not AFib, and vice versa. This is not. I think that this kind of examples have had a lot of relevance per se as doomsday of machine learning, and I don't think it's the point here. I think the point is, or at least there's not really immediate practical implications that come out of that. I think that the points that adversarial examples show us is that these systems learn something in a different way than humans do, and they might be fragile in ways that we don't expect. And so it really calls for thinking about a machine learning system as an end-to-end reliable and robust system that's integrated in a pipeline that goes from the data collection to actually the application. And this is the right-hand side part of the slides. This is actually doesn't come from the machine learning medicine community, it comes from the machine learning in the real world at Google, and almost tongue-in-cheek shows that the black box of machine learning code is really just a tiny piece, a tiny cog in the big machine on how do you analyze data and make actionable decision out of it. So you really have to think end-to-end when you develop that little box. Next slide.
Okay, so to conclude, we wanted to sort of arm you with some questions that you can ask next time that you're presented with an opportunity that involves machine learning. So this could be maybe a vendor selling you something, or an initiative from an informatics team at a hospital, something like that. These questions are adapted from this really nice article written by Karen Howe, who's the AI reporter for the MIT Tech Review. So the first question is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Second, how are you approaching the problem with machine learning? Third, how do you source the labeled data? Fourth, do you have a process for auditing the product? And fifth, should you even be using machine learning to solve this problem? So to make these questions concrete, I actually want to discuss them in the context of two examples, and we can kind of answer these questions for these two examples. So let me start by introducing these studies. The first is a study that came out of Google, and it's called Scalable and Accurate Deep Learning with Electronic Health Records. It's a retrospective study on electronic health record data, showing that this data can be used to make relatively accurate predictions on things like in-hospital mortality, unplanned readmission, prolonged length of stay, and the set of diagnoses that a patient will be discharged with. The second is a study that was done at a Chinese hospital. And the researchers showed in a randomized controlled trial that a machine learning system for computer vision could make endoscopists more effective at finding precancerous polyps during colonoscopies. And so just as a quick shout out, I found this study from following someone named Luke Oakton-Rayner. He's a radiologist and machine learning expert who writes really thoughtful critiques of medical machine learning research on his blog, and we've linked his blog in our resources section. So the first question was, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And this is an important question because answering it is just a prerequisite, obviously, to evaluating how well the approach works, how well you're actually solving the problem. And I like to break this question down into two levels, sort of what is the proximal problem and what is the ultimate problem. So for the first study, the scalable and accurate deep learning on electronic health record data, the proximal problem is that it's hard to predict important future events for patients like in-hospital mortality and unplanned readmission. And it's especially hard to do this at scale, given that physicians' time is limited. I think there are probably two ultimate problems here. The first is just improving patient outcomes. So presumably kind of connecting the dots, if you could accurately predict in-hospital mortality, you could act more effectively to prevent it. And the second is cost effectiveness or value of care. So if you could predict unplanned readmission, you could act to prevent it, thus saving a lot of money along with sort of improving patient outcomes and experience. For the second study, the proximal problem is that detection rates of precancerous polyps aren't perfect when it's just one human watching the video feed. And the ultimate problem is, again, improving patient outcomes, since presumably if you can detect more precancerous polyps, you can reduce the mortality rate from colon cancer. So one thing I just want to call out explicitly is that while both of these studies provide solid technical evidence that their approach is effective for solving the proximal problem, they don't directly address the translation from the proximal problem to the ultimate problem. And this translation is kind of much more in the domain of medical expertise than it is in machine learning. And it's something that we alluded to earlier when we talked about how machine learning needs to fit in the overall pipeline. So the second question that we recommend asking is simply, how are you approaching the problem with machine learning? So first, what is the input to the algorithm? And so for the first study, the one on EHR data, the input was simply a stream of unstructured electronic health record data. For the second study, the input was an image stream from a colonoscopy camera. Second, what is the output? So for the first study, the output was a probability of mortality or readmission or one of the other outcomes. And for the second study, the output was actually bounding boxes of the identified polyps. Finally, and actually I would argue least importantly, is what are the actual ML techniques being used? For both of these studies, the techniques were variants of deep learning. And the reason why I say I think it's important on one level to kind of understand at a high level what's going on, but I really think understanding the input and the output and how you're measuring the performance based on those inputs and outputs is more important often than understanding the details of what's happening under the hood. The third question that we recommend you asking is, how do you source the training data? So where does the data come from? And this is something we also alluded to earlier. So for the first study, the data was historical, and it came from 2 large US academic medical centers. For the second study, the data came from colonoscopy images from patients who went to a Chinese hospital, and it was annotated by experienced endoscopists. So why is this question important? Primarily because the data, as we talked about, the data that an algorithm is trained on might not match the data that's used on, and sometimes it's hard to generalize. So for example, in the first study, maybe there's something about academic medical centers that would make it difficult to apply these same techniques to small hospitals. Or for the second study, maybe there's something specific about the colonoscopy equipment that was used at this specific hospital that makes the problem easier in that domain or makes it difficult to generalize. And so these are just example questions. I don't know the answer to either of them, but they're the types of follow-up questions that I would want to ask once I understand where the training data comes from. Next slide, please. The fourth question that we recommend you asking is, do you have a process for auditing the product? And you can break this down into 2 parts. So first, how did you initially validate the algorithm's performance? And for the first study, the validation was, as I mentioned, on historical data, and it was using standard machine learning metrics, like the area under the ROC curve. For the second study, the validation was done actually as part of a prospective clinical trial in which doctors actually acted by doing biopsies based on the output of the machine learning system. The second part of this is, how do you continue to audit the performance of the algorithm over time? So medical data changes in systematic ways all the time. So for example, the switch from ICD-9 to ICD-10 could drastically change what EHR data looks like, and the use of new colonoscopy equipment could change the image quality. This phenomenon is called data drift, and it can affect an ML algorithm's performance, so it's really important to understand how the quality of the algorithm will be monitored over time. Neither of these specific research studies address this question, which is totally reasonable given that they're sort of academic proofs of concepts, but it's something that I'd really want to understand if I were being sold a product that was using machine learning or wanted to use something on a regular basis in an applied way.
Hey, Ben, we had a question just that was live that came up for clarification around machine learning and deep learning and how those two are related. That's
a great question. So anyone else can feel free to jump in. Machine learning is kind of the overall spectrum of techniques, and there's, as Irene mentioned, there's supervised learning, there's unsupervised learning, there's reinforcement learning. Deep learning is a specific set of techniques typically applied to supervised learning, but actually applied to all three. And it's, I see Irene shaking her head. Yeah, it could be actually unsupervised or deep learning, or reinforcement learning. And it's basically a set of techniques that are based on neural networks, which is a specific way you could build your model. So you could build a model with, say, logistic regression or random forests. Deep learning is based on neural networks, and one advantage of neural networks is that they can often learn many of the features for you. And there's been a pretty big sort of explosion in deep learning since around 2012 as we started to see kind of state-of-the-art performance from some of these techniques, particularly in computer vision, natural language processing, gameplay, and stuff like that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
And Jerome, thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you. So the last question that we recommend you asking is, should you actually be using machine learning to solve this problem? So will it benefit patients? And what are some of the second order effects that there might be from introducing machine learning in this domain? So I think for both of the studies, there's a pretty clear potential benefit for patients. And as far as second order effects go, I think it's always hard to predict these. And certainly kind of as a technologist, I don't feel that I have all the expertise necessary. But I just wanted to pose a couple of questions that I would want to understand in terms of second order effects for these studies, or how the results from these studies can be used. So for the first one, I'd want to understand kind of what downstream consequences might there be for a system that predicted discharge diagnoses. So how would this system interact with doctors who are also making diagnoses? And in particular, maybe could there be a potential for delegating too much responsibility to an algorithm? And it also kind of comes back to some of these interpretability questions that we mentioned earlier. For the second study, one question I'd want to understand is what happens if the system overdiagnoses? As I mentioned earlier, like machine learning will always make mistakes. Some of these will be false positives, and if you're going to do an invasive medical procedure based on these, what are the consequences of those, and how do those consequences weigh against the benefit of reducing cancer rates? So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Andy, who's going to go over some of the resources that we compiled and have been alluding to, and will lead us through a discussion.
Sure. Thank you all. So one of the things that we know, it's impossible really for us to explain all the elements of machine learning in a 1-hour session. And so we've put together a couple different classes and ways for you to dig into the work. At least for me, when I've done technical work, I often think that I understand it when I hear about it. And then once I start getting my hands dirty or playing around with things, I realize that there's a couple gaps that I need to have. And so if you're a hands-on learner, we have some resources here that you can use. The machine learning community on Twitter is also very active, and a way of staying on top of the new publications that are coming out. And in many ways, I view Twitter as kind of like the new version of peer review, because a lot of people will have comments or ask questions and refine the work in there. And what we'll do now is we're going to open this up for questions. You can ask either through Jen, I think we can have people either ask through typing through the Q&A or ask live. Should we only do it typing?
If folks can unmute themselves, absolutely. Speak up, no problem.
Great. And then a couple other things I think that might be helpful. We wanted to create a recording also that is particularly for smaller teams and companies who are thinking through how they want to onboard new employees or ramp up employees to learn more about this sort of work. And so if you found this to be really helpful, we would recommend, or we would love to hear if you wanted to share this within your community or share it with your HR team, and whether or not you like these specific grouped types of like deep dives. And then we can create more and more of these through DiMe as a way to help educate the community. So we have our first question from Vishnu. And so for Luca and Ben, Vishnu is curious about what kind of talent you're looking for when you're hiring for machine learning and healthcare roles.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say couple of things. For ourselves at Flatiron, we typically, for all of our technical roles, including sort of our machine learning engineering roles, we don't necessarily require healthcare background. We have a lot of healthcare and medical experts at Flatiron, and our approach is to kind of mix people who have technology expertise with people who have medical expertise, and we don't necessarily require everybody to know both. So that's maybe one aspect to it. I think other than that, we generally look for just kind of fairly typical software engineering competencies, ability to code, talk about systems, things like that. A little bit of machine learning, and then kind of just familiarity with machine learning, stuff like that. And then finally, one thing that we think is particularly important, at least at Flatiron, is an ability to kind of think through the kind of the product or the business side of things, and think about not only will this algorithm work, but will it work to solve this particular problem that we have.
Great, thank you.
For asset evaluation is a similar thing. I would say that coding is a requirement. Yes, because a lot of data science and machine learning specifically, as the joke goes, is around data cleaning and data transformation. So being able to do that is it really enables people to get to the next step, which is the modeling. I would say that we also look for a drive to health data specifically, and like interest in solving problems that relates to humans. Like looking at data itself could be pretty alienating if you don't connect it back to the overall meaning, at least in our experience. And finally, I think in the specific case of evaluation, we'll look for a specific expertise in understanding more, the biostats and epidemiology angle to it, by the kind of research that we do and the kind of outcome that we look at. It's very important to not overlook the decades of research, observational research that has been done in those domains, and reinvent the wheel with a machine learning flavor.
Great. We'll do two more questions. So Irene, we have one from Maxime, which is that public healthcare data sets are interesting but limited. For example, MIC, and EICU are only about ICU patients. Can you talk about what we should do when using data sets that we can't share to maximize the likelihood that our research could be replicable?
It's a tough question. I think there's a tension because it's very hard to get open health data sets. Privacy considerations are immense. Even something like MIMIC and EICU are great, and that took years of work, not to mention the people who are employed actively to maintain these data sets. If you have data sets that you're using and they're proprietary, that's totally fine. I think that that's part of the process, but I would recommend being as transparent as you can about all the things you can be transparent about. So who is in this data set? How did they collect it? What kind of code did you run? Can you release that code as long as it doesn't release any of the data, in the spirit of pushing research forward, even if you cannot release that specific data set forward? And that is a good way of contributing to the research community. And that way, if I do analysis on a related but different data set, I could say, hey, you did this analysis and it came up this way. Why might my results be different? And we can start that dialogue despite neither of us seeing each other's data.
And just something I've seen that was kind of interesting. I've seen a couple people try to create nutrition labels for data sets where they describe what's in it or how to compare them. And then I think there are certain ways to describe what's in the data that can be really useful without actually showing the data itself.
Oh yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Okay, last one. So from Rob Wilson, we have a question about how can we eliminate noise when building models, particularly around wearable sensing data that's accumulated in a real world setting?
I have no wearable experience.
I think that might be a Luca question.
Yeah, eliminating noise, I think, is the quest in general of machine learning. Specifically for wearable data and the time series component, I think thinking about missing data in contexts that are not only negative, missingness could actually be informative missingness and could actually be a signal for the kind of outcome that you're trying to predict. So I would say that it is important to do basic quality checks on the data that's collected. Various institutions and private public partnerships with FDA are putting out guidance. One of this is Stuart Margolis on how to actually evaluate the quality of patient-generated health data, or person-generated health data, as we want to call it now. But once that threshold of quality has passed, I think it is important to understand that missingness can actually be used to your advantage. And yeah, I can follow up separately after this call to give more pointers and discuss more in depth.
Yeah, and a reminder, you can reach all of us on Twitter, and I'll hand this over to Jen.
Fantastic. Andy, thanks for walking us through a tremendous session. And you said at the beginning that Ben, Luca, and Irene are some of the leading experts in our field. I think after that, everyone will agree. Thanks, guys. That was really tremendous. Couple of quick notes. First of all, we'll be sharing, as the team said, both the recording and the slides, so you can access all of the resources. This is how you can reach out to the gang using their Twitter handles. Coming up next at DiMe, if you're interested, we have a journal club on September 17th with Jesse Dacker, Bill Wood, and Alan Godfrey. So register for that if that's aligned with your interests. And also, one of the things that Ben said about Flatiron that sort of really resonated with all of us at DiMe is, you know, the need for us to sort of mindfully broker relationships between those with a high level of tech expertise. Andy, I'm not going with the have and have not. And also our clinical colleagues. That's something we're working on really hard here at the Digital Medicine Society. So if you're not yet a member and would like to join us, please think about it. Andy, Ben, Irene, and Luca, thank you so much. And have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.